Hi everyone, my name is José Mayoub. I'm the host of José Mayoub Pathology channel. This is the first episode dedicated to epistemology, one of my favorite areas of laws. I'm very happy this. Today we'll discuss relationship into law and epistemology, social epistemology. In the latter, the interview about the Northwest Prison Education Program led by Professor Lake. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. Professor Danilo Dantas, I would like to thank you support this interview.
No, I thank you for the opportunity of talking with Professor Lackey. So I'm Danilo Dantas. I am professor at Federal University of Paraíba here in Brazil, and I had my PhD in University of California. And I had the chance of seeing Professor Lackey talking in Florianopolis, I think so,
Mm-hmm.
uh,
I remember that. Mm-hmm.
2017, I believe,
Mm-hmm.
or 2016, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
So it's an honor to talk to you again, and I would like to thank you, Jose, for the
Thank you, Professor Danilo.
invitation.
Thank you so much, Danilo. It's an honor having you here. So, guys, I think everybody know Professor Jennifer Lake, but a brief introduction to Professor Jennifer Lake. Professor Jennifer Lake is one of the most renowned philosophers today, especially in social, applied, and testimony epistemology. She is the Wayne and Elizabeth Jones Professor of Philosophy at Northwestern University with a courtesy appointment as Professor of Law. She is Director of Northwest Prison Education Program, Editor-in-Chief of Episteme, Editor of Philosophical Study, and Subject Editor for Epistemology and the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. In Brazil, said Professor Lake, it's an honor having you here.
Thank you so much for having me. It's really a pleasure to have this opportunity to talk to both of you.
Thank you. Firstly, Professor Lake, what starts our personal question? What inspired you to study philosophy, especially epistemology, and which thinkers or personal experience have influenced your rights, especially your applied epistemology?
So I think that what first inspired me to be interested in epistemology, I took a class as an undergraduate in epistemology. I think it was maybe my third year as an undergrad, and I think that one of the things that really inspired me was thinking about our relationship to the world, and so you know, when we think about how we take everything in, you know, everything in the world is taken in through our conception of what we believe and what we have reason to believe and what we know, and really thinking through that. Um, I think that I became, very early on, I became interested in testimony. And I think it's kind of interesting because despite the fact that in many respects my work now is quite different in some respects from the work, like I think my current book that is coming out in I think March or April of this year is quite different from my first book on testimony. But in some respects, I've been interested in testimony since the beginning of my career, and that's in some respects what I continue to work on now, is still looking at epistemological issues that have to do with our connections with other people.
Thank you, Professor Lake. Professor Lake, I'm not sure United States is a similar scenario in Brazil, but in Brazil, the many law studies does not have a good view about philosophy. I don't know, they believe that philosophy it's no practical knowledge, it's no sense. So my question is, especially you are professor of law and philosophy, what is the relationship between law and epistemology? In what ways can epistemological study benefit law study and contribute to the improvement of judicial reason and decision making in courts?
So I actually think that epistemology is extremely relevant to lots of practical issues. I right now have been doing a lot of work at the intersection of epistemology and criminal law, But I also think that there are very significant questions that epistemologists and philosophers more broadly could ask about AI and about, kind of online interaction and policy and disagreement and polarization. And so I think that there's a lot of very important, practical, pressing issues that impact people's lives that philosophers can and should be contributing to. Um, the law is in a way kind of shockingly um, both philosophical and not philosophical. And what I mean by that is that there are lots and lots of issues that impact people's lives all the time that depend very heavily on philosophical questions that philosophers haven't really appropriately weighed in on. And so I think that there is a lot of room and a lot of importance in philosophers contributing to questions at the in the law, not only in criminal law, but that's kind of tends to be where my interest lies. So I'll just give you one example. I mean, I work with a lot of incarcerated people. I work in prisons, and I've met many people in the years that I've been inside of prisons who have falsely confessed to crimes that they didn't commit. And I do a lot of work on false confessions. And one of the questions that comes up a lot in the law is whether or not a confession was coerced. And there will be lots of cases in which members of the court, judges or prosecutors, will look at a video of an interrogation and determine on that basis, for instance, that the confession was voluntary. And this depends really heavily on how we understand what it means for something to be coerced, how we understand for something to be not free or involuntary. And yet there have not been many philosophers who have weighed in on, obviously there's lots of philosophers who work on questions about freedom and voluntariness and coercion, but there haven't been many who have weighed in on the question in the law. And so what that means is that you have people making decisions about whether or not, someone's testimony that sentenced them to a lifetime in prison is voluntary just by looking at the body language of some people in a video without really pausing to actually think about what it means for something to be involuntary or for something to be coerced. And that's just one example about how very life-changing decisions for people are made in ways that depend very heavily on our philosophical concepts. And yet, where there has not been, I think, sufficient engagement between philosophers and those practicing law.
Well, and so Professor Lake, I think everybody know in here, your work, especially your agrees in favor of the epistemology of testimony. So, Professor Lake, what is the epistemology of testimony? You mentioned in the first question, but how your perspective is different from more traditional views in the field?
More traditional views.
Sorry,
yes.
I also would like to know some spoiler about your new book.
Sure. But Jose, can you say what you said before the last part of your question?
Sorry. What is of the epistemology of testimony, and how does your perspective differ from more traditional views in the field?
Right. So, the traditional, like back when I was working on my dissertation when I was a graduate student, the questions that I looked at in the epistemology of testimony were really asking questions about like how it is that we come to know things on the basis of the testimony of other people. And my view back, and I haven't changed my view on this question, but my view differed from a lot of the traditional views because testimony was looked at as being very different from so-called generative sources, generative epistemic sources, like say, let's say sense perception, which is taken to be a source that can generate knowledge, new knowledge in its own right. And testimony was taken to be the sort of epistemic source that can only transmit knowledge, so it can't generate new knowledge. And that's because in order for me to know something on the basis of somebody's testimony, they have to know it and then just pass it to me, and they have to know it on the basis of some like a source that's not testimonial. And one of the things that I argued in my first book was that actually testimony itself can be a generative epistemic source. And part of the reason for that is that because we actually really learn from people's words rather than from their internal states. And I actually think that this is like, it's not just like a mechanical or like a like a counterexample kind of issue. I mean, I think that so much of the epistemology really was focused on what was going on inside their heads, so to speak. What do they know? And are they testifying on the basis of what they in fact know? But I actually think that that what people say and what people know come apart all the time. And that's really important to recognize, that like what we actually learn from is what people tell us rather than what they themselves know. So obviously what people believe or know and what they say comes apart when people lie, but also when people sort of conceal their own biases or prejudices and testify just on the basis of the evidence. I think both of those are cases where beliefs and knowledge can come apart from what people say. And so my early, my first book was really, it's called Learning from Words, because I think that we actually learn from people's testimony rather than from their internal states. So my current book project, which should be coming out maybe next month or April, it's called The Right to Be Known. And I'm really looking at, in some respects, I think you can kind of see it as like a sister book to my third book, where my third book, I looked, again, it's in a strange way, it's like there's testimony all the way through, because in the third book that I wrote, Criminal Testimonial Injustice, I was really looking at testimony that was extracted from people. So when the state gets people to say things that they wouldn't have otherwise said, and then the institution takes that testimony and has it play like like an oversized evidential role in criminal proceedings. So that was what I was looking at in the third book. And in my current book, I'm really looking at how, when we extract testimony from people in that way, when we coerce stories, or we, force people to say things, that oftentimes there are stories, narratives that then become sort of people's narratives, like people's stories, like the story of who they are or the story of their life. And that in order to do sort of like epistemically reparative work, we actually have to, in a way, give people their stories back. I mean, that's like a very broad way of thinking about it, but the right to be known is really the right that people have to be known for who they really are, rather than the stories that are extracted about them from the state, in a way. So that's a kind of a very broad way of understanding the current book project.
Great answer, Professor Lake. Professor Lake, you mentioned the book, The Right to Be Known. So my question is, it's impossible connection epistemic reparations and your another concept in the criminal testimony justice, epistemic agency, especially in cases the criminal injustice.
I'm sorry, can you say that again? I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I think I got most of it, but
my question is, Professor Lake, I was reading your book, The Criminal Testimony Justice, from this interview, and my question is, how can epistemic reparations be connected to epistemic agency, especially in criminal cases, injustice?
Yeah, absolutely. So I really do see the epistemic reparations as a sort of kind of, so in some respects, my criminal testimonial injustice book was looking at like how we harm people through the extraction of their testimony, and what that does to people's agency, epistemic agency. So the current book really, in some respects, I think epistemic reparations always begin with the centering of people's epistemic agency. I think in many respects, the biggest epistemic wrong that I'm looking at throughout all of my work is a wrong that targets people's epistemic agency. In many respects, the kinds of epistemic reparations I'm looking at are involve the state giving people back their epistemic agency to tell their own story. So let's just start with like a very simple example. The state, like through its police officers, let's say, extracts a false confession from somebody. That confession then becomes like the narrative of that person's life, right? So I just had a student from our program who graduated from the program that I direct. He's the longest wrongfully incarcerated person in the state of Illinois. He came home in December of 2023 after 42 years of being wrongfully incarcerated. And so for 42 years, he went to prison at 20, came out at 62. So for almost his entire life, the narrative that was told about him is that he's a murderer, he's a gang member, he's these sorts of things. And none of those things were true about him. That was the narrative, the official narrative of the state that the state told about him. And part of epistemic reparations involves sort of restoring his epistemic agency in ways that give him control over his own narrative and his own story. So that can look like a lot of different things. What we see in some nations would be like things like truth and reconciliation commissions, when you really need to get the truth out there in a sort of state governed way. You might have a truth and reconciliation commission where people come and provide testimony. The other way, there are also kind of like community organizations that provide spaces for people to sort of correct the record or tell their story or have their narratives be archived or documented or recorded. So I think that part of epistemic reparations is providing spaces for stories accurate, like sort of the accurate historical record of people's lives, let's say, to be told and to be documented in ways that make them accessible.
Great answer.
I would like to ask something about this testimony thing. I didn't read the book, but I was wondering, you're talking about like police officers extracting false testimonies. I was wondering if this false testimony can come from a less straight route. So, for example, if you remember Elizabeth Loftus' work about errors of memory, right? So maybe part of false testimonies can come from structural features of society that make people remembering stuff in a different way. Did you talk about this possibility in your book?
So I talk about, maybe I would say nearby phenomena. So I look at, so there's a lot of work on the relationship between, so here's just one example. So I talk about a lot of different things in the book. And for instance, this is just one example, but like, so like social structures that involve racism, for instance, impact the way that people even process information. So, there's all sorts of studies that show that white Americans view young Black men as being like larger than they are, right? And so then that is processed differently and stored in memory in different sorts of ways as being like maybe more dangerous or as moving faster, or so there's all sorts of ways in which social structures impact the way we take in information and the way that we process it. I also look in my work on the role that co-constructed narratives. So there's work in psychology that talks about how when people are engaged in conversations, especially about narratives, how listeners can be co-constructors of that narrative depending on the responses that they give. And so when someone is someone in a way that is supportive or healthy or has appropriate responses, those narratives actually get stored in memory differently than they do when somebody is interrupting or is disengaged or is, kind of a kind of listener that makes the narrative that somebody is telling less.
So, Professor,
on AI. So do you think that would be applied epistemology, even if it's not directly social epistemology?
Mm-hmm.
Or it can be like philosophy of science, maybe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think that the way that kind of the sort of terrain has gotten carved up is that applied epistemology is often taken to just be sort of like a, if you're doing applied epistemology, then you're sort of, yeah, by definition doing some sort of social epistemology. But I think that as epistemology has sort of well, first of all, as social epistemology has sort of exploded in many respects, um, I definitely don't think that we have to kind of hold on to all of those ways of kind of carving things up. I mean, there are many applied issues that we could take up that we don't have to regard as also being instances of social epistemology. I mean, many applied issues have to do with the social world. And so I think that's why they just get clumped, they just get like sort of categorized as social epistemology, because like questions about artificial intelligence, for instance, many of the questions that we're interested in that area has to do with the difference between AI and humans and learning from AI learning versus learning from humans. And so there's a lot of issues like that like kind of have to do with us interacting with others as like sort of social beings. And so a lot of those questions just kind of sort of get asked under the heading of social epistemology. But if social epistemology has come to kind of be like sort of include everything and it's no longer particularly useful, I mean, I think that it certainly is, I think that I wouldn't think that there would be anything problematic about moving over to more fine-grained divisions or distinctions within epistemology. I don't know if that answered what you were asking, but
Yeah, and I kind of agree. I will pass the word back to Jose, but before I would like to ask you a quick question. Like, you don't need to have an answer because maybe nobody has an answer, but do you think that LLMs like ChatGPT, they make testimonies?
um, I think that there's a lot of questions. I think that obviously the way that AI interacts, the way we interact with AI, and the way that AI interacts with us has changed and has gotten more sophisticated. But there were, I think, versions of these questions that people have been asking, and so I think that some of the questions, I don't know if I'm gonna like really answer it, but like I think one of the questions that is relevant in these areas is whether in order to offer testimony, it requires intentionality. Like, do I have to have the intention to so on my conception of testimony, I had a condition where you have to intend to offer communicable content. And the reason I wanted to distinguish that is because I think you need a framework for understanding the difference between me kind of going like this casually and you thinking that I'm waving to you and saying hello, and me actually doing something where I'm communicating hello, right? Or me nodding my head because a fly is in my head and you think I'm saying no, or you saying, do you, are you 6 feet tall? And I actually do say no, right? So I'm offering testimony in one of those cases and not in another. And one of the things that seems to distinguish those is that I have the intention to express communicable content with my gesture or my statement in the one case and not in the other. And so then what it ends up doing is like shifting the question over to, does ChatGPT have intentions to express communicable content? And I think that more people are, of course, people are going to divide on this question too, but I think more people are inclined to say no, that artificial intelligence does not have intentions. And so if you think that something like the intention to express communicable content is a necessary condition for some sort of testimonial act, then you're going to think that ChatGPT is not testifying.
Okay, so I'll pass the word back to Jose.
Thank you. Sorry, guys.
Thank you very much for the
Thank you so much.
the answer. I was trying to kind of tease you.
Uh, Professor Lake, in the context of the group epistemology, how do you understand the nature of lying at its the relation to deception at the collective level?
So, you like, so you're interested in like how I understand about like how groups lie, right? Is that's the, yeah.
Yeah, its connection, the deception,
Yeah.
nature of lying, its connection, the deception. You agree in the epistemology of groups, right?
Yeah, right. So one of the things that I think is really powerful about I think that before I wrote my book on the epistemology of groups, I don't think that people had really given an analysis of group lying, which is really interesting because when I was working on that book and I would give talks on group lying, I would always say that like we talk a lot about like corporations, like you know, like you know big corporations that are trying to like exploit people, charging too much. We talk about them lying or deceiving us, and yet when people talked about lying, they tended to focus on individual lying rather than anything like a group or a collective that could account for like a corporation, a corporation's action. So I always thought that that was really interesting. But one of the things that's really, I think, important when we think about group lying is I think that much of group testimony in general is communicated through some kind of spokesperson. Now, I don't mean spokesperson to necessarily be like a formal spokesperson, like a lawyer or a hired publicist. But no matter what, even if you have like imagine you have like a philosophy department, even with that, like typically if the philosophy department is going to be making a statement, normally it would be communicated by a member or a group of members who would draft the statement or make the statement. And so one of the things that's really interesting, I think, about thinking about group lying is that because so much group testimony is sort of communicated through representatives of the group, you can have a lot of cases where the actions of the individual members can really come apart from the actions of the group. So, for instance, I think that there's actually like there's like political significance and moral significance to thinking about this because we wouldn't want it to be the case that like a corporation like Philip Morris, who knows that smoking is unsafe, that they could get a spokesperson who believed that smoking actually was safe, provide some sort of testimony on behalf of the group, and end up so that the group was actually ended up telling the truth because they have a spokesperson who actually believes this. And so one of the things that I talk a lot about in my book is how it is really important to understand the conditions for lying when it applies to groups, applying to the group. Meaning, when we say like the group needs to state that P and believe, let's say, that not P, or not believe that P, and to be stating that P with the intention to be deceptive, that we understand that to be being done by the group rather than by individual members. And so yeah, I think that's kind of like the main one of the main kind of takeaways that I um, think is important when we think about group lying.
With answer, Professor Jennifer.
Okay, so I was thinking about the echo chambers, right? You have that book you organized about collective. No, it's in the fake news, the philosophy of fake news book of
Mm-hmm.
Steenbergen. You have
Mm-hmm.
a paper about echo chambers, and I'm interested in the interaction between echo chambers and the erosion of expert authority, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because in that, so some context, in that paper, you argue that echo chambers is not a problem, are not a problem by themselves, depends on the kind of echo chambers. But so now I'm
Mm-hmm.
thinking about some indirect route that it can be a problem, not in the sense of generating false beliefs directly,
Mm-hmm.
but
Mm-hmm.
generating erosion of expert authority. After all, if it seems to be part of the very idea of an echo chamber that we assign greater credibility to those within our chamber than
Mm-hmm.
to experts, right? And even if you assign credibility to experts, we assign it not because they are experts, but because they are in our echo chambers. So,
Hmm. Yeah, so I wonder. I mean, I think one of the reasons why I was really concerned about having an account of echo chambers where the problem is with the echo chambers is because I think that there can be echo chambers, I mean, at least just structurally, that are that really just include people who are experts, right? Do you know what I mean? Like there could be an echo chamber of experts. There could be an echo chamber of people who just, I mean, let's imagine that, like, you have like vaccine, like people who are anti vaccines, right? And they're all in an echo chamber saying, oh my gosh, vaccines cause autism, vaccines aren't safe. There's a conspiracy to get us to vaccinate our children. Okay, so that's one echo chamber, right? But then there can also be an echo chamber of people who are aware of who are experts in on vaccines and the studies that have been run on vaccines. And so I don't necessarily think that echo chambers are incompatible with expertise because I think that you can have echo chambers that include experts. I mean, so that's kind of why I think of echo chambers as being like really like a structural phenomenon. Do you know what I mean? It really is a structural thing. And that's why I think that when we talk about like echo chambers are bad, we need to ask like, well, wait a minute, what's in the echo chamber? What's going on in the echo chamber? And so I guess I do think that you can have echo chambers that include experts. I don't think that they're necessarily incompatible with them.
okay, so now I would like to make a question of one of our viewers. So it's Vinicius Rodrigues. He's part of our group in applied epistemology. He's doing the PhD in the south of Brazil, na URGS, in URGS,
Mm-hmm.
and he's doing some. Uh, I believe he's in US now, but I don't know where. I asked him. I tell you later. So he's asking, what are the unique lessons that applied and non-applied epistemology can learn from studying epistemic injustice, specifically in the criminal context?
What are some of the? Can you read the first part again? The what are some of the?
Yeah. So the lessons that apply epistemology and non-apply epistemology, maybe traditional epistemology, can learn from epistemic injustice in criminal context.
I think there's so much. There is so much to learn. I don't even know how to even begin answering that question. I mean, I mean, some of the most rewarding work I've done in epistemology in the last 10 years has been looking at ways that epistemology can analyze what's happening in the criminal legal system. And there's so many kinds of epistemic injustices and epistemic wrongs being perpetrated against people. And I think that, you know, there was so little work looking at the distinctive epistemic wrongs in those areas. So when somebody is coerced into falsely confessing to something, a crime that they didn't commit, for instance, it's like, it's not difficult to think about the ways in which they have been morally violated, right? Or politically violated by, being deprived of their liberty when they shouldn't be. But I think that, there was no work looking at what happens to somebody's epistemic agency when their testimony is not allowed to be responsive to reasons, right? So when we think about ourselves as epistemic agents in the world, we think about believing in relation to the evidence that we have about the world and offering testimony about the world in relation to the evidence we have about the world. And then when there are all sorts of mechanisms that come in and prevent us from doing that, both in terms of our beliefs and the testimony that we offer, it strikes at like the core of who we are as epistemic agents. We are just blocked from actually being able to think or reason or engage with other people in a way that is in the space of evidence and reasons. And so I think that, one of the things that's really important to look at in, like, for instance, the legal system, is all of the ways in which the particular mechanisms at work, the interrogation tactics, for instance, or when I was one of the last times I was in Brazil, I went to the Sao Paulo Police Academy and was talking to people there about like eyewitness identification procedures, right? Like, what are the procedures for lineups? And they were talking about all of the ways in which the way lineups were done, who would be put in a lineup was really impacting people's judgments, their, eyewitness identifications and so on, right? And so really thinking about all of the ways that we are victims of or perpetrate epistemic injustice or epistemic wrongs through these systemic practices of lineup procedures or interrogation tactics or plea bargaining processes and so on. I think it's extremely important to look at these systems in detail. That's why I think applied epistemology is actually, like, I think it's really important because it's, if we just stay at the level of providing theories, but we don't take those theories and show how, like, the American plea bargaining process is doing X, Y, and Z, it's very difficult to, it's not like the criminal legal system is going to do that, right? Is going to take this framework and apply it. So, yeah.
Yeah, I was listening to your answer, and I was thinking about. So I have asked you whether you think that ChatGPT make testimony, but maybe even if it does not, it may be the case that people see AIs, like, so for example, facial recognition AIs, as some kind of experts. And and we know that there are bias, like racial bias in facial recognition AIs. So I think that if we already have a bias in, like, in our memory, how we remember things, having the word of an expert saying that this is the guy wouldn't make it more probable that the person recognized somebody as a murderer or something. And I believe this is also a juncture between, like, social epistemology, applied epistemology, and AI that may be interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that well, so first of all, just how do we even understand what AI is? I mean, is it an expert? Is it a single expert? Is it just an aggregate of views of non-experts? Do you mean does the aggregate of non-experts make something an expert? Do you I mean, so I think there's all sorts of like really important questions about like how we even understand what it is. But then there's also, I think, as you pointed out, there's another question. There's what it is, and then there's how people are interpreting it too, right? And what people are doing with it. So, I mean, we've all seen the headlines about people falling in love with people on their chat bots, right? Or committing suicide because a chat bot told them to, or you know what I mean? And they took what they the testimony that they were giving them and thought that it was something that they should listen to. So I think that there's a lot of questions about how to understand AI and how whether it has epistemic status, and if so, what the epistemic status is. And then I think there's also just the question in terms of our social interactions, how people are understanding what it is and how that's impacting our interactions. Because like imagine like for instance that you know we're assessing practices in a legal system. Well, if the system is going to regard AI identifications as expert judgments, even if they're not, even if they shouldn't be, if the system is regarding them that way, that's going to have very significant epistemic and moral and political consequences. Um, so yeah, I think we need to look at both of those questions for sure.
So, Professor Lake, last question. I think everybody recognize the power of knowledge, the power of education, and I'm truly impressed by your leadership, the Northwest Prison Education Program. So my question is, Professor Lake, in your view, what is the transformative power of education, especially in the light of your work with the Northwest Prison Education Program?
So I always tell people who have been teaching for a long time that if they need to be reminded about the power of education, they should spend some time um, in um, in one of our classrooms because I mean I think that anyone who is an educator and anyone who has spent any time in the classroom has probably seen directly or indirectly the impact that education has. But it's probably over time, it's much slower typically. Maybe by the end of a quarter, you'll remember what your students' papers were like at the beginning. But I think in the prison education program, we see, I feel like I kind of almost personally see it on a day-to-day basis. I mean, people who came in, many of our students did not have a robust foundation in education before they went to prison. Many of them were disengaged from school for all sorts of reasons, or perhaps, you know, were in schools that were not very supportive, had really negative experiences with education, and, come to our classrooms filled with doubt and filled with fear and, imposter syndrome, and watching what education can do not only to people's minds but to their hearts and to how they see one another. We have students in our program who, on the outside would have been in rival gangs and would have never been able to have been on the same street with one another, let alone in the same class with one another. And now, to see them, reading drafts of each other's papers and debating, an interpretation of Plato's Apology or something, is really, it's really extraordinary. And, I think that the work that I do in prisons not only impacts me as a teacher, and as a person, but also as a researcher. I mean, I think the last two books I've written have really been inspired by my thinking of ways of bridging the work I do as a researcher in philosophy with the work that I do in the prison education program.
I would like to ask a question, like a more professional question, not of the subject, but about the profession. So we are talking about philosophy as being integrated with different parts of society. So your work you're talking about, for example. So do you think that our philosophy courses are uh, going together? They are following this route. So as a professor, I think it's very difficult because we have to explain like the traditional stuff, like in epistemology, and you have to go to applied epistemology, and you don't have time to do all those things. So,
Mm.
do you think that there are ways that the courses on philosophy could uh, be better by integrating those other things? So, do you have like some um, experiments you made in your career, stuff like that, so we can help us?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that these are questions. I mean, I have a couple of colleagues who reached out about maybe putting together a book in epistemology, like a more intro book that tries to get at some of these issues. Like, how do we have a book that both speaks to some of the traditional questions? Like, we don't want to no longer teach in our epistemology classes all of those traditional questions, which are really important to understanding theories of justification and theories of knowledge and looking at the applied issues. Like, I couldn't do the applied work that I do without having the foundation in epistemology that I have. But if you're teaching one class, how do you do that, and how do you also bring in some of these more applied issues? I mean, what I try to do in my classes is always like just you have to make decisions. And so the way that I teach epistemology has certainly evolved in the 20 plus years I've been a professor. Um, but I do, I mean, I do still teach all of the kind of traditional material, but I always kind of end on the note of some applied issues. I want my students to walk out of the classroom and see not only the theory and the framework, but I want them to see it put to work immediately. Because I think that for some students, being able to see that practical application of it is going to be the difference between thinking of philosophy as being relevant and philosophy as not being relevant. And so I always try to at least have one or two classes in every course that I teach where students can see immediately and directly how epistemological issues can be put to work concretely.
Yeah, it's a very difficult thing to do, right? But
Yeah.
that's our work.
Yeah, it is. It really is. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm happy with the questions and your answers. What
Thank you.
about you?
Mhm.
Professor Lake,
Jose.
many thanks for reception my invite. Sorry, my internet, and my best
No
wishes
worries.
your studies and your family. Thank you so much. You're a kind of person.
Thank you so much. It was really lovely to talk to both of you. Take care. Okay.
Thank you.
Bye bye. Bye
Bye
bye.
bye.
Thank you.